Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes tabletop role-playing settings and historical trivia. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson, hoping that my cold doesn't make me sound like one of the deep ones. Today, essential nature and intersexuality. One of the oldest controversies I can remember from the Ars Magica fandom is this. Given that magic can't affect your essential nature, can magic affect a character's gender? The generally given answer is no. Your gender can't be affected by magic, and in a large part, this is because the way gender is affected by magic in other role-playing games is so terribly juvenile. Basically, being transformed into a woman is seen as a shaming, disempowering, embarrassing thing, and so it's treated as a practical joke played upon male characters, a curse that they have to fight against and eventually have cured. Very early in the history of Ars Magica fandom, the writers indicated that the gift was found equally in male and female children, and therefore the Order of Hermes was an equal opportunity organisation. Strangely, the founders are not split 50-50 in terms of gender. However, you could claim that because they are all descended from a Roman priesthood, and the Roman priesthoods were in some sense patriarchal, that this reflected a cultural bias in the magical traditions from which they were descended. So, magic can't change your gender because your gender is essential to your character. This is rather a strange thought, however, because magic can do so much else to you that apparently isn't essential. Magic can make you older. Magic can turn you into a wolf. Magic can cut off your arm. And none of these things are prevented by your essential nature. There are some things magic can't do. It can't damn your soul. It can't permanently make you something other than human, although temporary cosmetic changes are possible. It can't make you younger because mortality is inherent. The question is, if your gender is an essential characteristic, like the freedom of the soul, how much resistance does this actually grant? Now, in terms of the freedom of the soul, your character can be forced to do things. Your character, however, is not morally responsible for those things. That is, if a magician takes control of a character's mind and forces them to commit murder, that doesn't damn the person's soul. Similarly, a character who sells their soul while under compulsion has not actually sold their soul, because they didn't freely enter into the contract. Sin can't be something that you do accidentally. It's a deliberate act, a knowing act. And this is why children beneath a certain age are considered, in 1220, to be incapable of sin. There is a rather terrifying folktale by the Grimm brothers that deals with this. In essence, it's called The Children Who Played Butcher with Each Other, and I think we'll leave that one there. If you're interested in folklore, and not particularly squeamish, I encourage you to look it up. Now, if your gender is protected from magic, does this include expressions of your gender? I'm not talking about the most obvious expressions of your gender either. So, I'm male, and I have androgenic forearm hair. That is, I have hairy forearms because I'm male. Given that that's a secondary sexual characteristic, and given that my gender can't be changed by magic, does that mean that my forearm hair has some sort of magic resistance? If you burn my forearm hair off, are you destroying a secondary sexual characteristic, and is it therefore protected by the concept of the essentialness of gender? Now, the medieval church had to deal with this matter because intersex people exist. In the modern United States, about 1.7 or 1.8% of babies are born, in some sense, intersex. The medieval church, noting this, indicated that if the child was able to function as one gender more capably than they functioned as the other gender, that was their gender. The point being that they had to pick one gender and then just get on with living in that gender role. There are all kinds of weird writings at the time indicating that physiologically the genders were a bit more permeable than later writers thought. There was some counsel that women shouldn't engage in strident exercise, eat warming foods, or take hot baths because it endangered their fertility by making them more masculine, and indeed had, in some cases, led to them changing sexes. Interestingly, although such folklore exists, there never seems to be any attempt to use this in a practical, mechanical sense to get over problems of inheritance. That is, kings who repeatedly have daughters rather than sons, like Henry VIII, for example, after his first two daughters, never attempt to force-feed their children pepper, submerge them in warm baths, and force them to go hurdling in the hope that they will suddenly become boys. So to wind this back to the essential point, it's often been said in Ars Magica that your character's sex, or possibly gender, is immutable, and the reasons for this are other role-playing games handle magical changes of sex so badly, and permanent changes of the mind of the character are seen as disempowering the player, so that if you had a male character and I said from now on you have to play female, it would be the same as if in a modern game your character were an American and I said, well, from now on your character is French. You might say, what does that mean? And now that you've done that to me, is my character still the same person? Or have they been permanently taken away from me until I, in some sense, bring them back to my original design by curing them? Now, I'd argue that in Ars Magica, we have a mechanism which allows us to sidestep all of these issues, and it's Mystery Cult Initiation. Mystery Cult Initiation means that your character can't trivially choose to alter deep and ingrained features of the character, but can still undergo metamorphoses, fundamental changes, which means that your character can choose to spiritually transcend realities which they consider limitation. And this would mean that if your character was transgender, for example, you could choose to undergo ritual initiations which allowed your character to change from one sex to another. Indeed, there are certain ancient Greeks who had this done to them by fairies, so you could find folkloristic examples. The best known case is the blind seer who was turned into a woman for a certain period of time by one of the goddesses and was thought to have gained wisdom from having experienced life in both genders. You could argue that some characters, House Creaman members for example, might find that useful as a path to greater spiritual enlightenment. You might argue that some characters, like members of House Bjorna, may choose to be protean of gender or race, rather than, as they currently are, protean of species, that is, rather than turning into a wolf and having the senses of a wolf and learning the things that only wolves know. It would be possible for the character to change genders or change races and know the things that only people in those other communities know. This allows us to pass tangentially through the territory of real-world magical traditions who see twin-spirited people or shamanistic people as living on the margin of their community, protecting the known from spiritual forces outside the community, and therefore standing at the border of other social divisions, such as the gender division. So to conclude, I understand why early Ars Magica fandom decided that a male character cannot become a female character through hermetic magic. I would, however, like to suggest that the later initiation script mechanism gives the player enough control over the process that it becomes a role-playing challenge rather than a childish joke or punishment, and so I would suggest that this allows a loophole which troops can explore if they find it suits their campaigns.